statue of Saint Mary breaks during the Mass and reveals something that terrifies everyone. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the Church of San Isidro, painting the pews and stone walls in vibrant hues of red, blue, and gold. The atmosphere was serene, almost otherworldly, as the congregation gathered for Sunday Mass. The church, a central pillar of life in the small mountain town of Santa Cecilia, was alive with the murmurs of prayer and the faint rustle of hymnals. The air smelled faintly of incense, a comforting familiar fragrance to those who attended every week. Father Mateo, a gentle and steadfast figure, stood at the altar, leading the service with quiet authority. His voice, resonant and soothing, carried through the vaulted space, blending with the soft creak of the old wooden pews as worshipers knelt and rose in rhythm with the prayers. Among the congregation was Sophia, a spirited young woman who had grown up within the embrace of this church. She had spent countless hours helping to prepare for services and events, often seen darting between tasks with an energy that belied her small frame. Arturo, an elderly artisan with weathered hands and a deep connection to the church, sat near the front. Decades earlier, he had crafted the statue of Our Lady of Perpetual Grace that now presided over the altar. It was his pride and joy, a masterwork that had become the spiritual and visual centerpiece of the church. To Arturo, the statue was more than stone and gold leaf. It was a representation of faith itself. As Father Mateo continued the Mass, a strange and sudden noise shattered the tranquility. It began as a faint creak, so subtle that only a few heads turned in curiosity. Then it grew louder, becoming a groaning sound that reverberated through the nave. Before anyone could react, a loud crack echoed like thunder. Gasps rippled through the congregation as eyes turned to the statue. A fissure had appeared along the torso of Our Lady of Perpetual Grace. The statue, untouched and unmoved for years, seemed to tremble as if alive. Another crack followed, and a piece of the stone fell away, revealing a golden object embedded within. The gleam of the gold was startling, almost surreal against the dull gray of the fractured stone. A collective murmur of alarm swept through the crowd. Sophia's eyes widened, and without thinking, she rushed toward the altar. Father Mateo, caught between his role as a leader and his own mounting unease, moved to intercept her but stopped short when he too saw the golden object. Arturo, sitting just a few feet away, clutched the edge of the pew with trembling hands. His face turned ashen, as if he had seen a ghost. "What is it?" Sophia whispered, her voice trembling as she looked back at Father Mateo. The priest shook his head, unable to form an answer. The congregation began to rise, their voices a cacophony of fear, curiosity, and confusion. The quiet sanctity of the Mass had been replaced by chaos. Arturo finally spoke, his voice barely audible. It cannot be." His words carried a weight that silenced those around him. Sophia and Father Mateo turned to him, seeking answers, but the old man looked away, his expression clouded with a mix of fear and guilt. The golden object shimmered faintly in the sunlight, drawing the gaze of everyone present. It was ornate, covered in symbols that seemed both familiar and alien. Sophia, always inquisitive, stepped closer despite Father Mateo's protests. "We have to see what it is," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. As Sophia reached out to touch the object, Arturo suddenly cried out, "Don't! You don't know what you're dealing with!" His voice was sharp, almost panicked. The congregation froze, their collective attention now split between the mysterious relic and the artisan who had created the statue. Father Mateo, ever the mediator, placed a calming hand on Arturo's shoulder. "What do you know, Arturo? Please, tell us." But the old man simply shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Not here. Not now," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Later, after the congregation had dispersed in uneasy silence, Sophia and Father Matteo gathered near the altar with Arturo. The golden object, still partially embedded in the statue, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the church. Arturo sighed heavily, the weight of decades pressing down on him. "I should have spoken up years ago," he said, his voice filled with regret. "When I helped to build this statue, the church leaders brought me something unusual. They told me it was a reliquary, meant to protect the town. I was sworn to secrecy, and like a fool, I obeyed." "What does it protect us from?" Sophia asked, her curiosity now tinged with fear. Arturo shook his head again. "I don't know the full truth, but I was told it must never be disturbed." Father Matteo frowned, his mind racing. "Why now? Why would it crack open during the Mass?" Arturo looked at the priest, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and urgency. Perhaps because the faith that bound it is fading, or perhaps it's a warning. The three of them stood in silence, the golden relic casting long shadows on the stone floor. Outside, the sun began to set, its light filtering through the stained glass windows one final time, as if to mark the end of an era and the beginning of something far more uncertain. As night descended on Santa Cecilia, the church loomed large against the starry sky, its silhouette sharp and imposing. Father Matteo, Sophia, and Arturo stood in uneasy silence by the altar, their earlier conversation heavy on their minds. Arturo's revelation about the golden reliquary had left them with more questions than answers, but it was his hesitant mention of a crypt beneath the church that had driven them to action. Armed with lanterns and a mix of courage and trepidation, they began their descent into the forgotten depths of the church. Arturo led the way, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he pushed aside a section of the altar's base, revealing a concealed trap door. The hinges creaked loudly as the door was pulled open, the sound echoing through the otherwise quiet sanctuary. A narrow stone staircase spiraled down into darkness, its air thick with the scent of earth and time. "This place hasn't been opened in decades," Arturo murmured, his voice barely audible. "Maybe longer." Father Matteo held his lantern high, the flickering light illuminating the rough stone walls as they descended. "What are we expecting to find down here?" he asked, his voice steady but low. "Answers," Sophia replied, though her grip on the lantern she carried betrayed her nervousness. She was determined to see this through, despite the growing unease that gnawed at her. The staircase eventually opened into a small, musty chamber. The air was cold and damp, and their breaths formed faint clouds as they stepped cautiously inside. The room was lined with shelves, each filled with dusty tomes, crumbling scrolls, and strange objects that seemed older than the church itself. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, its surface etched with the same cryptic symbols that adorned the golden reliquary. Sophia moved closer to the pedestal, her lantern casting shifting shadows on its surface. "These markings," she began, tracing them with her fingers, "they're identical to the ones on the reliquary." Arturo nodded grimly. "I remember these symbols. They were on the plans for the statue, too, but no one ever explained their meaning. They just said they were part of the design." Father Matteo joined Sophia at the pedestal, examining the symbols with a critical eye. "This isn't just a design. It's something deliberate, something meant to hold power. But what kind of power?" Arturo swallowed hard. "The kind meant to keep something out, or in." Sophia's gaze shifted to the shelves lining the chamber. "There has to be more here, something to explain all this." She began searching through the ancient books and scrolls, her fingers leaving trails in the thick dust. Father Matteo and Arturo joined her, their movements careful as they handled the fragile materials. It was Sophia who found it first. A thick, leather-bound tome tucked away in the corner of one shelf. Its cover was embossed with a faded image of the reliquary, and its pages crackled as she opened it. "Look at this," she said, her voice tinged with excitement and dread. She began to read aloud, translating the archaic language as best she could. The text spoke of a malevolent force called the Shadow of Desolation, a spirit that had once plagued the region with misfortunes, illness, and despair. The townsfolk of Santa Cecilia, desperate to rid themselves of the curse, had turned to the church for salvation. "They performed a ritual," Sophia continued, her voice trembling as she read. "A communal act of faith to seal the shadow within the reliquary. The reliquary was then hidden within the statue, its power sustained by the town's unity and belief." Father Mateo frowned deeply. Unity and belief. If that's true, then the weakening of faith in this town could have caused the seal to break. Arturo's face was pale as he listened. When the reliquary was placed in the statue, I remember a man, a visitor, saying something about this. He called it a safeguard, but he also warned that the seal would only hold as long as the people believed in it. Sophia set the book down, her hands trembling slightly. "So if the seal is broken now, does that mean the shadow is free?" The three exchanged uneasy glances. The room seemed colder, the flickering lantern light casting shapes that felt almost alive. Arturo broke the silence. "There's something else. I remember, years ago, helping the church leaders move the reliquary into the crypt before they built the statue. They said it was temporary, just until the statue was ready. But they warned me never to disturb anything down here." Father Mateo's brow furrowed. Why would they bring it down here at all? Arturo hesitated before answering. "They said the crypt was sacred ground, a place where the church could protect it if something went wrong. They must have thought the shadow couldn't reach it here." Sophia's eyes scanned the room again, her heart pounding. If the reliquary was here before, there might be more records about what they did to seal it, maybe even instructions for how to do it again. Father Mateo nodded. "We have to find them. If the shadow has been released, we need to understand how to stop it before it spreads." The three continued their search, their urgency mounting as the weight of their discovery settled over them. The crypt, once a forgotten relic of the church's history, now felt like the key to the town's survival. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, as if the shadow itself was aware of their presence. As they worked, a faint sound broke the silence, a low, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from the very walls of the crypt. The three froze, their eyes darting around the chamber. "Did you hear that?" Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Father Mateo gripped his lantern tightly. "We need to hurry." Arturo, his hands trembling, pulled a scroll from one of the shelves and unrolled it. His eyes scanned the faded text, his expression darkening with each line. This says the shadow was never fully destroyed. It's not just a spirit. It's something older, something that feeds on fear and discord." Sophia's heart sank. Then the broken statue isn't just a coincidence, it's a warning. The whispering grew louder, filling the chamber with a sound that was both chilling and mournful. The three stared at each other, fear etched into their faces. Father Mateo, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes, spoke at last. "Then we'll face it. Together." The crypt seemed to shudder slightly as they gathered their findings, preparing to ascend back to the church. Whatever lay ahead, they knew it would test their faith and the strength of their community. like never before. The bells of the Church of San Isidro rang out across Santa Cecilia, their sonorous chimes cutting through the stillness of the mountain air. It was an unusual sound at this hour, and one by one, the townsfolk emerged from their homes, drawn by the urgency of the summons. They arrived at the church in small groups, murmuring questions to one another as they passed through its heavy wooden doors. Inside, Father Mateo stood near the altar, his expression grave, while Sofia and Arturo arranged the materials they had brought up from the crypt. The congregation filled the pews slowly, their faces etched with unease. They had not forgotten the events of the morning, nor the unnatural sound of the statue cracking open to reveal the golden relic. Now, under the flickering light of candles, they looked to their priest for answers. When the last of the villagers had settled, Father Mateo stepped forward. He raised his hands, and the murmurs quieted. "My friends," he began, his voice steady though the weight of his words was evident. "I've called you here tonight because our town faces a grave threat, one that reaches beyond the material world." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. The townsfolk exchanged glances, some skeptical, others fearful. Sofia, standing to one side, could feel the tension growing, the same undercurrent of division that had been quietly eroding the community for years. She clenched her fists, determined to help bring them together. Father Mateo continued, his gaze sweeping over the gathered villagers. This morning, when the statue of Our Lady of Perpetual Grace cracked, it revealed a reliquary hidden within. That reliquary was placed there to protect us from a force known as the Shadow of Desolation, a malevolent presence that once plagued Santa Cecilia. Decades ago, our forebears performed a ritual of faith to seal it away, but now, he hesitated, his voice faltering briefly. Now, that seal has been broken. Gasps filled the church, followed by a cacophony of voices. Some dismissed his words as superstition, while others whispered prayers under their breath. Luis, a pragmatic farmer known for his skepticism, stood and addressed the priest. "Father Mateo, with all respect, how can we believe this? A broken statue doesn't mean a curse. Maybe it's just old, or maybe it's a sign of something else entirely. But a shadow? A curse? It sounds like a story for children." Before Mateo could respond, Beatrice, one of the oldest and most respected members of the community, stood as well. Her voice, though frail, carried authority. "Luis, I've lived in this town long enough to remember the stories. My grandmother told me of the misfortunes, the crops failing, the sickness spreading, families turning against one another. It was real, and it nearly destroyed us. I don't know what to make of all this, but I know the shadow is not just a story." Her words silenced the doubters, at least temporarily. Sofia seized the moment to step forward. "The records we found in the crypt confirm what Beatrice is saying. The shadow thrives on fear and division. If we don't act together, if we let doubt and mistrust take hold, it will only grow stronger." The villagers sat in uneasy silence, their fear now mingling with uncertainty. Luis crossed his arms, his skepticism unwavering but his expression troubled. Others murmured their agreement with Sofia and Beatrice. Father Mateo raised his voice again, firm yet pleading. "This is not a battle of superstition versus reason. This is a call for faith, not blind faith, but faith in each other. The ritual that sealed the shadow all those years ago was not performed by one person alone. It required the unity of the entire community. We must come together again if we are to protect Santa Cecilia." A young mother, holding her child tightly, spoke up from the back. "What do we need to do, Father?" How can we stop this? Sophia stepped forward, her voice confident despite the weight of the situation. We need to recreate the ritual. It's not just about words or symbols. It's about coming together as one. Every person in this town has to contribute, has to believe. We'll need to prepare offerings, prayers, and above all, unity. The murmurs returned, but this time they carried a sense of determination. Villagers began discussing what they could bring, what they could do. Luis, though still skeptical, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. Beatrice placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something that seemed to soften his stance. Arturo, standing quietly until now, spoke up with a steady voice. I will craft a new pedestal for the reliquary. Something strong, something that can hold it during the ritual. It will take all night, but I will have it ready. Sophia nodded gratefully. I'll help organize the offerings and gather the materials we need. We'll need candles, incense, and anything else that symbolizes our shared hope. Father Mateo looked out at the villagers, his heart swelling with both pride and urgency. This is not just about a ritual. It's about remembering who we are as a community. The shadow feeds on our fear and discord, but if we stand united, we can drive it back. I believe in all of you. The church buzzed with activity as the villagers began discussing their roles. Even those who had been hesitant moments before found themselves swept up in the collective effort. Sophia moved through the crowd, encouraging those who wavered and reassuring those who were afraid. She knew this was only the beginning, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Sophia glanced out the stained glass windows and felt a shiver run down her spine. Whatever was coming, it would test them all. But for the first time in years, the town of Santa Cecilia felt like a united front. As the villagers dispersed to begin their preparations, Father Mateo and Sophia remained in the church, lighting candles and saying quiet prayers. Arturo had already retreated to his workshop, determined to craft the pedestal that would hold the reliquary. The shadow lingered at the edges of their awareness, a dark presence they could not see but could feel. Sophia turned to Father Mateo, her voice quiet but resolute. Do you think we can do this? Do you think it's enough? Father Mateo looked at her, his expression a mix of determination and uncertainty. I have to believe it is. Faith is not the absence of doubt, Sophia. It's the decision to move forward despite it. They stood together in the dimly lit church, the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. The bells, now silent, seemed to echo faintly in their ears, a reminder of the urgency that bound them all. Time was running out, but for the first time, they felt the flicker of hope. The night air in Santa Cecilia was charged with anticipation and tension. The villagers gathered outside the church of San Isidro, their faces lit by the soft glow of lanterns and the flickering flames of hundreds of candles. The reliquary, now placed on a beautifully crafted wooden pedestal Arturo had worked tirelessly to complete, stood at the center of the altar. Its golden surface shimmered faintly, as if alive, reflecting the collective energy of the people surrounding it. Sophia moved through the crowd, her voice steady as she gave instructions. Everyone, take your places. Form a circle around the altar and hold hands. We need everyone here. This has to be done together. The villagers followed her lead, their movements hesitant but resolute. They had spent the day gathering offerings, bundles of flowers, jars of honey, and personal tokens of hope and gratitude, all of which now surrounded the pedestal in a carefully arranged display. Some carried rosaries, others simple trinkets that held meaning for them. The ritual was not about grandeur, it was about the power of shared intent. Father Mateo stood at the altar, his hands clasped tightly as he prepared to lead the prayers. His voice, usually calm and measured, now carried a note of urgency. My friends, he began, his words resonating in the still night. "We stand here tonight, not just as individuals, but as a community. The shadow that threatens us feeds on our fear, on our divisions. But we are stronger than that. Together, we can drive it back. Together, we can protect our town." A hush fell over the crowd as the ritual began. Father Mateo raised his arms, reciting the ancient prayers they had found in the crypt. The words, unfamiliar to most, seemed to carry a power of their own, resonating deeply within the walls of the church and beyond. The villagers joined in with their own prayers, their voices blending into a unified chant. The sound was raw and imperfect, but it carried an undeniable strength. As the prayers continued, a faint wind stirred through the church, causing the candles to flicker. The reliquary, resting on its pedestal, began to emit a soft golden glow. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but kept their focus, tightening their grips on one another's hands. Sophia stood near the front, her eyes fixed on the reliquary. She could feel the air growing heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't fully understand. The glow from the reliquary grew brighter, casting long shadows across the walls. The ancient symbols etched into its surface seemed to shimmer and shift, as if alive. The wind picked up, swirling around the congregation, and carrying with it a faint whisper. It was unintelligible, yet it seemed to resonate with something deep within each of them. A reminder of fears long buried, doubts unspoken. Suddenly, a low guttural sound echoed through the church, freezing the villagers in place. It wasn't a sound any of them could identify, but it carried a primal weight, a sense of something ancient and malevolent. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The villagers clung to one another, their collective fear threatening to undo the fragile unity they had built. "Do not let go!" Father Mateo shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Hold on to one another! Do not give in to fear!" Sophia tightened her grip on the hands of the villagers beside her, her heart pounding. "We're stronger than this," she called out, her voice trembling but defiant. "We have to believe in each other." The reliquary's glow intensified, becoming almost blinding. The golden light seemed to push against the darkness that now filled the church, a living, writhing presence that threatened to consume them all. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on forms that were both human and inhuman, their movements jagged and unnatural. Sophia felt a surge of determination. Breaking away from the circle for just a moment, she stepped toward the altar, her voice ringing out above the chaos. "We won't let you take this town," she shouted, directing her words at the unseen force. "You thrive on fear, but we won't give it to you." Her words seemed to ripple through the air, and for a moment, the darkness hesitated. The villagers, inspired by her courage, began to shout their own defiance. One by one, their voices rose, a cacophony of resistance that pushed back against the oppressive weight of the shadow. The reliquary, now glowing with an intensity that rivaled the sun, pulsed once, twice, and then released a burst of radiant light that filled the entire church. The shadows recoiled, writhing and twisting as if in agony. The roar reached a crescendo before abruptly cutting off, leaving behind a profound silence. The golden light faded gradually, leaving the reliquary resting on its pedestal, its surface cool and unassuming once more. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their hands still clasped, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The oppressive weight that had filled the church was gone, replaced by a deep sense of calm and peace. Father Mateo lowered his arms, his face etched with exhaustion, but also profound relief. "It is done," he said softly. "The shadow has been driven back." The villagers began to release one another's hands, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. Sophia turned to Arturo, who stood near the back, tears streaming down his weathered face. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We really did it." Arturo nodded, his hands trembling as he wiped his eyes. "You were right, Sophia. We're stronger together." In the days that followed, the villagers worked together to construct a small chapel within the church, a new home for the reliquary. It was a symbol of their unity, a reminder of what they had overcome. The reliquary, now resting safely in its new pedestal, seemed to radiate a quiet strength, a testament to the power of collective faith and determination. Father Mateo, Sophia, and Arturo stood together during the chapel's inauguration, their hearts filled with gratitude. The townsfolk, once divided and uncertain, now stood as a unified community, stronger than they had been in years. The chapel light, an eternal flame placed above the reliquary, glowed softly, a beacon of hope and resilience for generations to come. Though the memory of the shadow would linger, it no longer held power over Santa Cecilia. The town had faced its darkness and emerged into the light, forever changed, but undeniably stronger.